He didn't knock. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Victor Blackstone didn't knock when he walked into her kitchen. He pushed the door open with the flat of his palm like he already owned the place, his boots leaving mud tracks across the floor she'd scrubbed that morning, his eyes moving around the room with the slow, contemptuous satisfaction of a man taking inventory of something he intended to acquire. He looked at her the way people had always looked at her, like she was furniture, like she was in the way. "Where's Callahan?" he said. Not good morning, not excuse me, just that. Clara set down the cast iron pan she'd been holding and turned to face him fully. "He's out on the north pasture. You're welcome to ride out and find him." Victor smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I'll wait." He pulled out a chair at her table, and sat down without being invited, spreading his papers out like he was settling into his own office. And Clara stood there in her own kitchen feeling the old familiar weight of it. The assumption that she didn't matter, that her presence in a room changed nothing about what a man with money and confidence chose to do. She'd felt that weight her whole life. She knew exactly how heavy it was. But she also knew, now, that she didn't have to carry it alone. If you've ever been the person everyone overlooked, the one they sent away thinking it would break you, stay with me. Because this is the story of what happens when they're wrong. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Says, the letter arrived on a Thursday. Clara knew it was Thursday because Thursday was the day her mother did the household accounts at the kitchen table, spreading receipts across the oilcloth with a focused misery that filled the whole room, and everyone knew to stay quiet and stay small on Thursdays. Clara had gotten very good at staying small. It was, in many ways, the skill she had perfected above all others. She was 28 years old and still living in her parents' house in Leavitt, Missouri, a fact that her mother mentioned with reliable frequency. Not cruelly exactly, but with a particular brand of exhausted disappointment that landed harder than cruelty would have. Her two younger sisters, Delia and Rose, had both married before their 22nd birthdays. Delia's husband owned a dry goods store. Rose's husband had prospects. Clara had neither a husband nor prospects, and the house had quietly organized itself around this fact the way a body organizes itself around a chronic pain. Everyone aware of it, no one talking about it directly. The weight of it distributed across every ordinary day. She was not ugly, she knew that. But she was large, broad-shouldered, and full in a way that the women's magazines called robust when they were being charitable and didn't call anything when they weren't. And in Leavitt, in 1887, large and unmarried at 28 meant one specific thing to the people who thought about such things. She was somebody's problem that hadn't been solved yet. She'd heard it said, not about her, but near her, which was worse. The Whitmore girl. Such a shame. Pretty face, but the but was always the end of the sentence. The but was the whole story, as far as Leavitt was concerned. The letter came addressed to her father, which was ordinary enough. Most correspondents did. And her father left it on the side table near the door without opening it for 3 days, which was also ordinary. It was Delia who found it first. Delia who read it. Delia who carried it into the parlor where Rose was sitting and said, in the voice she used when something genuinely delighted her, "Oh, you have to hear this." Clara was in the hallway, and she heard everything. The letter was from a man named Ethan Callahan, writing from a place called Hollow Ridge, Wyoming. He'd placed a classified advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper, Clara learned this later, seeking what he called a practical wife. He was a widower. He had a young son. He ran a cattle ranch that was, by his own careful accounting, in a period of significant difficulty. He was not looking for romance. He was not looking for a woman of particular beauty or social standing. He was looking, the letter said plainly, for someone with backbone. Someone who could manage a household under hard conditions. Someone honest, patient, and unafraid of work. Delia read the relevant portions aloud in a voice dripping with performative pity. He says he's 41. Wyoming, Rose. Can you imagine? Rose made a sound that meant she could not. Someone should write back, Delia said, and then she laughed, and the laugh had a particular shape that Clara recognized immediately, the same shape as every joke that had ever been made at her expense, the laugh that preceded something designed to humiliate. Clara stood very still in the hallway. "We should send Clara," Rose said. And Delia laughed harder and said, "We absolutely should." They did it that same evening. Clara found out later that they'd written a response on her behalf, using her name, her age, a careful selection of her most mundane qualities rendered in language designed to sound appropriately pathetic. They'd found the original advertisement in their father's copy of the St. Louis paper. He subscribed, though he rarely read it, and sent a reply to the address listed. They told no one. They considered it a private joke, the kind that would be funny precisely because nothing would come of it, or if something did come of it, it would be funnier still. What they did not anticipate was that Ethan Callahan would write back within the week. Clara intercepted the letter by accident. She was the one who collected the post on Fridays, had done so for years without anyone thinking much about it, and when she saw the envelope with the Wyoming return address and her own name written in an unfamiliar hand, she stood at the end of the front walk for a long moment before she understood what she was holding. She didn't open it in the street. She carried it to the back of the property, past the kitchen garden and the old woodshed, to a spot near the fence where a particular oak had grown at an angle that created a kind of shelter. And she sat down in the dirt in her good dress, and she opened it. Ethan Callahan's handwriting was uneven in a way that suggested a man more accustomed to physical work than correspondence. The letters were formed carefully, like he'd thought about each one, which meant the letter had taken him some effort to write. He didn't begin with pleasantries. He began with a direct acknowledgement that the arrangement he was proposing was unusual, and that he understood a woman of sense would have questions and hesitations, and he intended to answer whatever she asked honestly because he did not have time for anything else. He described Hollow Ridge without sentimentality. The winters were brutal, and the summers were not forgiving, and the work never stopped, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. The ranch had 900 acres and a good herd that had been reduced by a bad season and needed rebuilding. He had a son named Noah, who was 7 years old and who was, Ethan wrote this carefully, choosing the words, not easy to know right now, but worth the effort. He said his first wife had died of fever 2 years prior, and he was not writing to replace her. He was writing because the ranch needed 2 people to run it, and he was only one person. He asked about her, what she knew, what she could do, what she was willing to learn. He did not ask what she looked like. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time. She sat with her back against the angled oak and listened to the ordinary sounds of the yard. Her mother calling to someone inside, a dog barking 3 properties over, the dry August wind moving through the grass. And she felt something she couldn't immediately name. It took her several minutes to identify it because she hadn't felt it in a long time. She felt like someone was asking her a real question. She wrote back that afternoon. She sat at the small desk in her bedroom with the door closed, and she did not think about Delia or Rose, or what they'd written, or what they'd intended. She thought about what he'd asked, and she answered it. She told him she could manage accounts, and she'd been doing it for her father's household for 6 years. She told him she'd never run a ranch, but she understood the principles of it. She'd read, she was a dedicated reader, she learned things from books, and then she tried them. And she was not afraid of hard work, because hard work was the only variety she'd ever known. She told him she was 28 years old and large in build, and that people in her town considered her unmarriageable, and she thought he should know that going in, not because she agreed with them, but because she did not intend to misrepresent herself to a man asking for honesty. She sealed the envelope. She walked to the post office herself. She mailed it without telling anyone. 3 weeks passed. She went about her ordinary life, the accounts, the cooking, the invisible labor of a woman in a house that needed her but did not particularly want her. Delia had by then apparently forgotten the whole affair, or considered it concluded, or simply moved on to other entertainments. Rose had moved back to her own home. Their father didn't read his mail. Their mother was preoccupied with a dispute involving the church social committee that Clara found difficult to care about. When Ethan's second letter arrived, Clara was again the one to collect the post. This one was longer. He'd received her letter, he said, and he wanted to ask her several more specific questions. Not tests exactly, but the kind of questions a man asks when he's starting to take something seriously. He wanted to know about her temperament. He wanted to know if she'd ever managed employees, and if not, whether she thought she could. He told her more about Noah, about the boy's silences and his distrust, and the specific grief of a child who had learned that the people he loved left. And he told her this not to frighten her away, but because he believed she deserved the full picture. He also said something at the end that Clara read, and then sat down and then picked back up. He said, "I don't need someone perfect. I need someone real." She wrote back the same day. The correspondence continued for 6 weeks, 5 letters from him, 5 from her, each one longer than the last, each one building toward something she didn't have a name for yet. She hid the letters in the back of her winter blanket chest. She did not tell her family. She told herself she was not keeping a secret so much as making a decision, which required privacy, not concealment. But she knew, by the 4th letter, what the decision was going to be. It was Delia who forced her hand, in the end. Delia, who had a habit of reorganizing the linen closets when she visited, found the letters on a Sunday afternoon in October, when Clara was downstairs making supper. Clara heard her sister's footsteps on the stairs first, then the sound of them stopping in the hallway, then Delia's voice carrying down with a brightness that had something hard underneath it. "Clara, come up here, please." She'd been found out, and she knew it before she reached the top of the stairs. Delia was standing in the hallway with the letters in her hand. She'd read enough of them to understand what they were. Her face was doing something complicated. Surprise first, then amusement, then something that was not quite either of those things. A look Clara didn't have a name for, something between contempt and discomfort. "What is this?" Delia said. "Letters," Clara said. "Mine. From the man in Wyoming." Delia held one up. "The widower with the struggling ranch." "Yes. You wrote to him." "I did." Delia looked at her for a moment. "Clara, we sent that as a joke." "I know." We didn't actually think." Delia stopped, started again. "He thinks he's corresponding with you." "He is corresponding with me," Clara said. "That's exactly what he's doing." Something shifted in Delia's expression. The amusement collapsed into something flatter, and Clara recognized that look too. It was the look of someone recalibrating, reconsidering the joke that had apparently stopped being funny. "You're not seriously considering, Clara, Wyoming. He doesn't even know what you look like. He knows everything that matters. You're 28 years old. I'm aware of that. You've never lived anywhere but Levitt. I'm aware of that too." Delia lowered the letters. Her voice shifted, softer, and somehow that was worse because soft from Delia meant pity, and pity from Delia felt like a closed door. "You're not going to go," she said. "You can't actually be thinking about going. What would Mother say? What would people—" "I'm going," Clara said. She hadn't been certain of it until she said it. The moment the words were out, she understood they'd been true for several weeks, and she'd simply been waiting to speak them aloud. Delia stared at her. "He didn't ask for you. He asked for— the advertisement. It was for someone— It was for someone with backbone," Clara said. "Someone honest and patient and unafraid of work." She reached out and took the letters from her sister's hand. "I'd like to think I have a reasonable claim on at least one of those." The conversation that followed was loud. It involved their mother and eventually their father, and a great deal of language about propriety and risk, and what people would think, and whether Clara understood the danger of traveling alone to meet a man she'd never seen in a territory she knew nothing about. Clara listened to all of it. She answered calmly where an answer was required. She did not raise her voice. 2 weeks later, she booked passage on the westbound train. She packed one trunk. She packed her books. 4 of them, practical ones. A volume on ranch management she'd ordered from St. Louis, a dictionary, a medical reference, and a collection of short stories she'd read 7 times and intended to read 7 more. She packed her warmest clothes and her most durable boots and a small collection of household tools she'd quietly acquired over the years, the kind of things a woman accumulates when she's the one in the house who actually fixes things. She did not pack her girlhood. She was not sorry to leave it. Her mother saw her off at the train station with an expression that managed to combine genuine grief with deep and sustained bewilderment. Her father shook her hand, which was not something he had done before, and said, "Take care of yourself," in a voice that sounded like he meant it, which also was not something he had done before. Delia was not there. Clara climbed aboard the train and found her seat and placed her hands in her lap and watched Leavitt, Missouri, shrink through the window and become a memory and then become nothing at all. She was not afraid. That surprised her when she checked. That absence of fear. She'd expected to find it somewhere, packed in alongside the anxiety and the uncertainty and the very reasonable awareness that she was traveling thousands of miles to marry a man she knew only through paper and ink. But what she found instead was something closer to steadiness, like a level floor under her feet after years of walking on ground that tilted. She was going somewhere where no one knew what she was supposed to be. She was going somewhere where she would be judged. Eventually, she was not naive enough to think otherwise, but judged for what she did rather than what she looked like doing it. She pulled Ethan's last letter from her coat pocket and read it again. The final paragraph, which she'd memorized but still wanted to see in his particular uneven handwriting. "I think you're exactly what this place needs," he'd written. "I cannot promise you ease. I cannot promise you comfort or beauty, or the kind of life you might have hoped for when you were younger. I can promise you that whatever you build here, you will have built it yourself, that it will be yours, that no one can take that from you." The train moved west through the flat Missouri farmland. Clara folded the letter along its worn creases and tucked it back into her pocket. Outside the window, the world was opening up in every direction, enormous and indifferent and full of weather. And Clara Whitmore pressed her shoulder against the seat back and let herself feel, very briefly and very privately, the thing she'd been holding carefully for 6 weeks without letting it fully open. She was going somewhere she might matter. She held that thought like something fragile, like something she hadn't learned yet how to carry without spilling. The train carried her west, and the land stretched on, and the sky over Missouri gave way to the wider sky of Kansas, and then beyond. And Clara watched all of it with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 28 years being told she wasn't worth looking at, and who had finally, after all that time, found somewhere worth looking toward. What she did not know yet was that Hollow Ridge was watching the road from the east, that a man was checking the calendar with a frequency he found embarrassing, that a 7-year-old boy had asked once, just once, in a voice he'd tried to make sound like he didn't care about the answer, "What if she's mean?" And Ethan had said, "Then we'll figure it out." And Noah had said, "What if she's not?" And that was the question neither of them had quite known how to finish. The train pulled into Hollow Ridge just after noon on a Tuesday, which Clara knew because she'd been counting days since Kansas City with the focused attention of someone who needed to know exactly how far she was from everything familiar. The station was smaller than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected much. A wooden platform, a water tower, a man in a canvas coat standing with his hat in his hands at the far end of the boards. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outdoors rather than from age alone. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and he was squinting in the direction of the train with an expression that she couldn't read from this distance. Clara took her trunk and her bag and descended the steps onto the platform. She did not hurry. She had learned a long time ago that hurrying toward a judgment did not change the judgment. It only got you there faster. Ethan Callahan saw her coming, and something moved across his face. She watched it happen, watched him process the information her appearance delivered, watched him work through whatever gap existed between what he'd imagined and what was walking toward him across the Hollow Ridge train platform on a Tuesday in November. He didn't look away. She gave him credit for that. A lesser man would have found something else to look at. When she was close enough, he put his hand out and said, "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Callahan," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm and brief, a working man's handshake, the kind that wasn't performing anything. He looked at her directly. She looked back. "Long trip?" he said. "Yes." "Hungry?" "I could eat." He nodded and reached for her trunk, and she let him take it, not because she couldn't manage it herself, but because some things were not worth making a point about in the first 5 minutes. They walked to his wagon in silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who knew a great deal about each other on paper and almost nothing in person, and were both intelligent enough to understand that the distance between those two things was going to take time to cross. The road out of town ran northwest through low, scrubby hills that looked like nothing Clara had ever seen. Missouri had its own beauty, heavy and green and full of water, and this was its opposite, wide and dry and pale brown in the November light. The sky enormous above it, in a way that made her feel briefly like the top of her head had been removed. She did not say this. She sat on the wagon bench and watched the country pass and tried to understand what kind of place this was. "Noah's at the ranch," Ethan said after they'd been riding for 20 minutes. "He knows you're coming. He didn't have much to say about it." "How much does he know?" "He knows his father wrote to a woman, and the woman wrote back, and now she's here." A pause. "He's a smart kid. He's probably worked out the rest." "How is he doing?" Clara said. Not quite a question. The letters had told her enough that she wasn't asking from ignorance. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "He's managing. He's been managing since his mother died, and I think sometimes he's better at it than I am, which is not a thing a man likes to admit about his 7-year-old. He said this without self-pity, just statement of fact the way he wrote, direct and a little stripped down, like he'd learned that economy with words was its own kind of honesty. Clara nodded. They didn't speak again for several miles, and she found she didn't mind it. The ranch came into view in the middle of the afternoon, a cluster of buildings in a wide, flat bowl between two low ridges, the main house, and a barn, and several outbuildings in various states of repair. The fencing she could see from the road was functional but rough, patched in places with mismatched lumber. The yard was clean enough but not tended. It was, she thought, the physical appearance of a place running on maintenance and not much more. Not falling apart, but not thriving. The kind of place that needed two people. A boy was sitting on the top rail of the fence nearest the house. He was watching the wagon come down the road with the specific stillness of a child who is pretending not to care about something very much. Ethan pulled the wagon up and set the brake. The boy did not move. "Noah," Ethan said. The boy looked at his father, then at Clara. His face was composed in the way children compose their faces when they are working very hard at something, and what Noah Callahan was working hard at was the appearance of indifference. He had his father's coloring, but something softer in the eyes, something that reminded Clara of the letters, of Ethan writing not easy to know right now, but worth the effort, and she understood immediately and completely what he had meant. "Hello," she said. She didn't say you must be Noah because he knew who he was and it would be condescending, and she didn't say nice to meet you because they hadn't met yet, not really. She just said hello and let it sit there. Noah looked at her for a long moment. "You're bigger than I thought," he said. Ethan said, "Noah." "It's all right," Clara said. She looked at the boy. "I'm bigger than most people think. You get used to it." Noah considered this. "My friend Tommy's ma is big," he said. "She makes good pie." "I make adequate pie," Clara said. "I'm better at bread." Something shifted in the boy's expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the first small relaxation of a held position. He got down from the fence rail and walked toward the house without further comment, which Clara would later come to understand was, for Noah Callahan, a form of acceptance. Ethan watched his son go and then looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I'm sorry about—" "Don't be," she said. "He's honest. I'd rather that than the alternative. But—" The house was larger than it looked from the road and colder than it should have been. The stove in the kitchen needed cleaning, and she could tell from the draft that the main chimney needed checking. The furniture was plain and mostly functional, with the specific disorder of a place maintained by people who were tired and did not have enough hours in the day. She cataloged all of this in the way she cataloged most things, quickly, without editorializing, filing it away for later. Ethan showed her the room that would be hers. Small, with a south-facing window and a narrow bed and a dresser with a sticky-bottom drawer, and she liked it immediately because it was hers, and hers was a category of things she'd had very little of in 28 years. "Supper's usually around 6, he said from the doorway. "I do the cooking. It's not— it's edible." "I'll do the cooking," Clara said. He looked uncertain. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She set her bag down. "What is Noah like?" Ethan blinked. It was the kind of blink that meant the question had caught him somewhere he wasn't defended. "He likes—" Honestly, he eats whatever's put in front of him. He doesn't complain. That's not what I asked. A pause. He likes cornbread, and he'll eat 3 helpings of anything with potatoes if you don't stop him. Good, Clara said. I can work with that. She made supper that first night from what was in the kitchen, which was not a great deal, but she'd made meals from less. And she kept it simple and warm and didn't make a production of it. When they sat down at the table, the 3 of them, in the first real silence of the evening, she noticed that Noah ate with the contained focus of a child who had learned not to expect much from mealtimes and was pleasantly surprised to be wrong. He looked up once, partway through, and said, "This is better than Pa's." "Noah," Ethan said. "It's just true," Noah said, and went back to his plate. Clara looked at her own plate and did not let herself smile until the moment had passed. That was the first night. The weeks that followed were harder and more complicated, and nothing like the clean beginning she'd sometimes let herself imagine on the long train ride west. The ranch work started at 5 in the morning regardless of weather, and the weather in Hollow Ridge in November was not gentle about announcing itself. The first real cold front came in on her 4th day, dropping the temperature to something brutal and coating everything in a skim of ice that made the morning chores an exercise in controlled misery. Clara learned the specific cruelty of Wyoming cold. Not just the number, but the quality of it, the way it got into everything, into seams and cracks, and the spaces between your fingers even through thick gloves, the way it made simple tasks require twice the effort and 3 times the attention. She did not complain. She was not, constitutionally, a complainer. But she made mental notes with the same diligence she'd applied to the ranch management books she'd read on the train, cataloging problems and cross-referencing them with what she knew, building a picture of what the ranch needed and what it would take to get there. The hands were 3 men, a wiry older cowhand named Pete, who had been with Ethan for 6 years and regarded Clara's arrival with cautious neutrality, a young man named Charlie who was 18 and tried to be invisible whenever possible, and a 3rd man called Stu who had the particular quality of someone who had decided to dislike her before she arrived and was simply waiting for the evidence to confirm it. She could read Stu in the first 10 minutes. She'd known men like Stu her entire life, men who experienced a competent woman as a personal accusation. She didn't worry about Stu. She worried about the books. Ethan gave her access to the ranch accounts on her 6th day, after she'd asked twice and he'd hesitated both times, not suspiciously, but with the reluctance of someone handing over something that showed the extent of a wound. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers on a Sunday afternoon while Ethan was out checking fence line and Noah was at the neighbor's place, and she read the numbers with the same careful attention she'd given his letters. The picture they painted was not good, but it was not hopeless, which was worse in some ways than hopeless. Hopeless meant you could stop worrying about the specifics. Not hopeless meant there was still something to lose. The debt was manageable, but it needed managing. The cattle numbers were down from a bad previous winter, and the recovery was slower than it should have been. The contracts Ethan had with the regional buyers were old and had not been renegotiated in 4 years, which meant he was selling at rates that no longer reflected the actual market. There was a water rights arrangement with the neighboring property that had an irregularity she flagged in her mind and set aside to look at more carefully. And there were expenses in the ledger that didn't make obvious sense, small amounts, inconsistent, scattered through the last 2 years, that she couldn't immediately explain. When Ethan came in that evening, she was still at the table. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that was partly question and partly braced for something unpleasant. "Well," he said. "Your buyer contracts need renegotiating," she said. "You're leaving money on the table every quarter, and there's an entry in March of last year." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "Here, $42 to a company I can't find any record of. Do you know what this is?" He leaned over the table and looked at where she was pointing. His expression changed. "I don't know what that is," he said slowly. "There are 4 more like it. Different amounts, different months." She'd marked them with small pencil lines. "They could be nothing, but I'd want to know what they are before I assumed that." Ethan sat down across from her and looked at the ledger for a long moment. He didn't say, "How did you find that?" or "Are you sure?" or any of the things that would have been condescending. He said, "Pete handles the supply orders, but he brings me the receipts." Are you sure he brings you all of them? A silence. Long enough that Clara knew the answer was not yes. I trust Pete, Ethan said. He said it the way a man says something when he's not entirely sure it's true anymore. I'm not saying don't trust him, Clara said carefully. I'm saying these entries need an explanation, and right now they don't have one. It might be something simple, bookkeeping error, a vendor who changed names. It might be nothing. She looked at him steadily. But you should know. Ethan looked at the ledger. He looked at her. You found this in one afternoon. I was looking at the whole picture, she said. Sometimes that's easier when it's not yours. He sat back in his chair and ran one hand over the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Then he said, What about the buyer contracts? What would you do differently? She told him. It took 40 minutes, and she used the ledger as reference, and she talked about market rates and seasonal timing and the specific leverage that a ranch with Callahan's acreage actually had in the regional market, which was more than Ethan had apparently believed. He listened with the focused attention of someone receiving information he understood the value of, asking questions that were good questions, not performing interest but actually engaged with the problem. At some point, Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightclothes, having come home while they were talking and evidently put himself to bed without interruption, which said something about how often that had been necessary. He looked at his father, he looked at Clara, he looked at the open ledger on the table between them. Are you arguing? He said. No, both of them said at the same time, which was the first time they'd said anything at the same time, and it startled all three of them slightly. Noah considered this. Okay, he said, and went back to bed. After he was gone, there was a moment of quiet in the kitchen that was different from the quiet earlier in the evening, less careful, somehow, like something had settled. He asked me last week if you'd leave, Ethan said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the doorway Noah had just disappeared through. Before you came, he asked if I thought you'd leave after you saw the place. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. He looked at her then. That was honest. It was, Clara said. I appreciate that. Do you think you will? Leave. She considered the question the way she considered all questions, seriously, without performing certainty she didn't have. I think I came here to build something, she said. I don't have much interest in doing the building and then walking away from it. He nodded. It was a short nod, the kind that meant I heard you rather than I believe you completely, the kind that meant I'm going to watch and see, and that was fair. That was exactly fair. She didn't want belief she hadn't earned. The weeks accumulated. She did not transform the ranch overnight, and she didn't try to. She made changes the way she did most things, methodically, one thing at a time, attending to what was broken before she attended to what was merely inefficient. The chimney got cleaned, which improved the kitchen temperature by a significant amount that everyone noticed without anyone mentioning it explicitly. She reorganized the supply system in ways that reduced their monthly spending by almost a fifth, not through any dramatic intervention, but simply by paying attention to what was being ordered twice and what was being wasted and what could be sourced locally rather than from the regional supply house that was charging them for the distance. Pete turned out to be exactly what Ethan had said he was. A good, careful hand who had been with the operation long enough to be part of its institutional memory. The discrepancies in the ledger were explained by the third week. A supplier Pete had contracted with briefly had been fraudulent, charging for deliveries that were short-weighted, and Pete had been covering the difference out of adjusted orders without telling Ethan because he was embarrassed to have been taken. Clara worked through the records, identified the actual shortfall, and told Ethan what she'd found in terms that made it clear this was a problem with the supplier rather than with Pete. The relief in Pete's face when Ethan talked to him about it was the kind of relief that takes years off a person's appearance. After that, Pete stopped being neutrally cautious around Clara and started being something adjacent to respectful. Stu remained Stu. Noah remained complicated in the specific way that Clara had come to understand was not about her at all. He was a child who had lost his mother at 5 years old, who had watched his father go from a man who laughed regularly to a man who managed, and who had spent the subsequent 2 years developing very effective emotional armor that he wore consistently and that only occasionally slipped enough to show what was underneath. He was not unkind to her. He was watchful. He answered questions when she asked them and sometimes offered information without being asked, which she came to understand was, for Noah, significant. He told her once, without apparent context, that his mother's name had been Eleanor, and that she used to sing in the mornings, and that he couldn't remember the songs anymore, just the fact of them. And Clara had said that sounds like a good thing to hold on to, and Noah had nodded and gone outside, and neither of them had mentioned it again. She was careful with Noah, not performatively careful, not tiptoeing in a way that would register as effort, but genuinely careful, the way she was careful with anything fragile and worth protecting. She did not try to mother him. She tried to be present in a way that asked nothing of him and offered something real, reliability, mostly, consistency, the same version of herself every morning regardless of what the previous day had been like, which was harder some days than others, and which Noah had apparently started to notice by the end of the second month. He came into the kitchen one evening while she was doing the last of the supper clearing and said, without preamble, "Pete says you fixed the problem with the feed supplier." "Pete and I worked it out together," Clara said. "Pete says it was you." She turned from the sink. Noah was standing in his usual watching from a doorway posture, arms crossed, chin slightly up. "Pete is generous," she said. "He said you didn't make Pa feel bad about not catching it." "Your father is running a ranch and raising a son, and managing more than one person should have to manage at once," Clara said. "He missed something in the accounts. That doesn't make him careless." Noah looked at her steadily for a moment. "He wasn't like this before," he said, and there was something careful in how he said it. Not accusatory, just true, the way children are sometimes true in ways adults have learned to soften. "Before my mother died, he was different." "I know," Clara said. "Do you?" "From his letters," she said, "and from watching him. You can see it, the shape of who someone was before, if you look carefully enough." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Is he going to be okay?" The question was so direct and so unguarded that it landed differently than most things Noah said. Clara dried her hands on the kitchen towel and looked at the boy and told him the truth, which she'd found was the only currency he respected. "I think he's getting there," she said. "I think it's slow, and some days are worse than others, and he doesn't always know how to ask for help. But yes, I think he's going to be okay." Noah considered this. He looked at the floor, then back up. "Okay," he said, and went to bed. Ethan had been standing in the hallway. Clara didn't know how long he'd been there. She found out later it had been most of the conversation, that he'd come in from the barn and heard Noah's voice and stopped, not wanting to interrupt. He was in the doorway when she turned around, and his face was the most unguarded she'd seen it since she arrived. He didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't press him. "Thank you," he said finally. It came out rough, not quite steady. "He asked me a real question," Clara said. "He deserved a real answer." Ethan nodded slowly. He looked like a man reassembling something he'd taken apart a long time ago and half forgotten how to reassemble. And she watched him do it and didn't look away and didn't fill the silence, because some silences were doing their own necessary work, and interrupting them was a kind of harm. He said goodnight and went upstairs, and Clara finished clearing the kitchen, and outside the wind came off the ridgeline and pressed against the walls of the house the way Wyoming wind did, testing, relentless, finding every weakness. And the house held. It held because someone had cleaned the chimney and checked the window seals, and paid attention to the small things that added up to whether a structure could withstand what the country threw at it. Clara knew something about that. By the end of the third month, the ranch was not fixed. Fixing a ranch in 3 months was not possible, and she'd never expected it to be. But it was different. The accounts were ordered and understood and being actively managed. The buyer contracts had been renegotiated, a conversation she'd prepared Ethan for over 2 weeks, and that he'd conducted himself, returning from town with a settlement that was 11% better than what he'd been accepting. The supply chain was leaner. Pete had stopped looking worried all the time. Charlie had started talking, which turned out to mean that Charlie was actually quite funny once he'd decided a person was worth the energy. Stu quit on a Thursday in January. He didn't give a reason. He collected his pay and rode out, and Pete said good riddance under his breath, and Clara didn't comment either way. She hired his replacement herself, a woman named Ada Greer, who was widowed and needed the work, and turned out to be extraordinarily capable with horses, better than any of the remaining hands, a fact that caused a brief period of adjustment among them that Clara watched with interest and did not intervene in, because Pete was smart enough to recognize capability when it was standing in front of him, and he came around inside a week. Ethan had looked at her after she offered Ada the position, with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and something else. "You didn't ask me," he said. "You said I could handle the hiring," Clara said. "Did you want me to ask?" A pause. "No," he said. He stopped. "You're not who I expected." "I know," Clara said. "Neither are you." He looked at her for a moment. Really looked at her the way he had on the train platform that first day, working through the gap between what he'd expected and what was actually there. Except this time there was no gap to bridge, or not the same kind of gap. This time what he was looking at was familiar. "The buyer in Casper wants to meet," he said. "He's heard the operation is being run differently." "Differently how?" He said efficiently. There was something in Ethan's voice she'd come to recognize as the closest he got to pleased. Flat, but with a current underneath it. Warm if you knew where to listen. He said he'd heard the Callahan books were being kept properly for the first time in 3 years, and he wanted to talk about an expanded contract. Clara considered this. "When does he want to meet?" "March." "That gives us 6 weeks to prepare," she said. "That's enough." "Are you going to come?" She looked at him. "Do you want me to?" He said, "Yes," without hesitation, and she believed him. And that was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that yet because they were both too careful and too practical and too aware of how many ways careful things could still go wrong. But she believed him. And that night, when she sat at her desk in the small south-facing room to write the letter she'd promised to send her mother, monthly, just enough to prevent complete estrangement, she noticed that the room felt less like a place she was occupying and more like a place where she lived. It was not a dramatic realization. It arrived the way most real things arrived, quietly, without announcement, wearing the ordinary clothes of an ordinary evening. She lived here now. She picked up her pen, and she wrote, and outside the Wyoming dark settled over Hollow Ridge with its particular weight and particular silence. And the house held it the same way it held everything, imperfectly, stubbornly, the walls warm from the fire and the chimney drawing clean, standing because someone had paid attention to whether it was standing. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The meeting in Casper went better than expected, which Clara had learned to treat with the same caution she treated anything that went better than expected, because good news in her experience had a habit of arriving with a hidden bill attached. The buyer's name was Harlan Moss, a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 50s who ran 3 regional contracts and had the manner of someone who had been lied to often enough to make directness his default mode. He'd shaken Ethan's hand, looked at Clara with open curiosity, and said, "You're the one keeping the books." "Among other things," Clara said. He'd liked that. She could tell by the way he stopped performing skepticism and started actually listening. And by the end of 2 hours, they'd agreed to terms on an expanded contract that would increase Callahan's quarterly return by nearly a third if they hit the production numbers, which Clara had already calculated they could hit if the spring calf season was reasonable, and Ada kept doing what Ada was doing with the herd's conditioning. They rode back to Hollow Ridge with the signed agreement in Ethan's coat pocket, and the particular silence of 2 people who had just done something that mattered and hadn't yet worked out how to talk about it. Somewhere past the second ridge, Ethan said, "You told him about the water rotation system." He asked about the pasture management. "He asked about pasture management because you brought it up." "It was relevant," Clara said. "He increased the offer 20 minutes after you explained it." "I know." There was a pause that had something almost warm in it. "You planned that," Ethan said. "I prepared for that possibility," Clara said carefully. "There's a difference." He looked at her sideways with that flat current underneath expression and said, "Clara." "Yes." "That was good work." She looked at the road ahead. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without making a production of it. March became April, The calving season arrived with its usual combination of new life and exhausting emergency, and Clara discovered that she had a particular steadiness in a crisis that even Pete acknowledged. Not verbally, but by the simple fact that when something went wrong at 2 in the morning with a distressed heifer and Ada was handling 2 other animals and Ethan was 3 pastures over, Pete came to get Clara. She spent 90 minutes in the cold and the dark, doing something she had never done before in her life, and which she had read about extensively in the ranch management book. And the calf survived, and Pete looked at her across the animal with the expression that said everything he would never put into actual words. Spring opened up the country in a way that Clara had not anticipated. She had arrived in November and thought she understood Wyoming, the cold, the wind, the enormous impersonal sky. She had not understood what it looked like in April, when the grasses came up green between the brown and the hills shifted their colors daily, and the whole enormous country seemed to be doing something complicated and alive. She found herself stopping sometimes, just for a moment, just to look at it, which was not something she did often, because there was always something that needed doing, but some things demanded acknowledgement. Noah caught her doing it once, standing at the fence line looking north toward the second ridge where the light was doing something particular with the clouds. He stood beside her without comment for a moment, then said, "My mom used to do that." Clara didn't respond immediately. She waited to make sure he was finished. "Stand and look," he said. "She said the country needed witnesses." "She sounds like she was thoughtful," Clara said. "She was." He paused. "She would have liked you, I think. She didn't like people who performed." Clara looked at the boy, who was looking at the ridge. He was 8 now. He'd had his birthday in February, and she'd made the cornbread he liked, and Pete had carved him something from wood, and Ethan had given him a knife of his own, which Noah had received with the careful reverence of a child who understood that objects sometimes carried weight beyond themselves. "I don't know if I would have liked myself at your mother's age," Clara said. "I was still trying to figure out what I was for." Noah looked at her. "Do you know now?" "Getting there," she said. He nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and went to find Charlie, and Clara stayed at the fence another moment looking at the ridge and thinking that Eleanor Callahan, whoever she had been, had raised a child who asked real questions and accepted real answers, and that was not a small thing to leave behind. It was in the 3rd week of April that Victor Blackstone first came to the ranch. Clara was in the kitchen when he arrived. She'd seen the dust of his approach and heard the wagon before she saw it, and she'd been at the window long enough to read the posture of the man on the seat before he pulled up. There was a quality to how Victor Blackstone sat, upright, deliberate, arranged, that she recognized without knowing his name. She'd seen it in men her whole life, the posture of someone who expected the world to receive him as important, and had been disappointed often enough by the world's failure to do so that the expectation had curdled into something with edges. He was perhaps 50, thick through the chest, with a face that had been handsome once and had gone to something harder. He was dressed well. Better than anyone else in the county dressed, probably, which was a kind of statement. 2 men rode behind him that she noted but didn't make a point of noting. Ethan came in from the barn, and Clara watched the greeting from the kitchen window. It was short. Ethan's body language was careful in a way it wasn't usually careful. Not tense exactly, but positioned, the way a man positions himself when he's trying not to show that something makes him uncomfortable. She had the coffee ready when they came inside. Blackstone walked in and looked at the room the way he'd probably looked at every room he'd ever walked into. As real estate, as an inventory of what was worth keeping and what wasn't. His eyes landed on Clara with the brief disinterest of a man categorizing something as irrelevant, and then he looked away. "This is Clara," Ethan said. "My wife." It was the first time he'd used the word. They'd had a quiet ceremony in December with the county clerk and Pete and Ada as witnesses, and the word wife had been in the paperwork since then, but this was the first time she'd heard him say it in introduction, in front of someone else, and it landed differently than she'd expected. Victor Blackstone glanced at her again. A second pass, this one more considered. "I'd heard Callahan had taken a bride," he said. His voice was pleasant in the specific way that some dangerous things were pleasant. The pleasantness was real, just not the most important thing about him. "Coffee?" Clara said. "Thank you. No." He turned back to Ethan, and Clara moved to the far end of the kitchen, close enough to hear, removed enough to be overlooked. She had learned, over 28 years, the specific usefulness of being overlooked. "I'll come to the point," Blackstone said. He set his hat on the table, not asking, just doing it, and folded his hands. "I'm acquiring land in this county. You know the Perkins place sold last month. The Hartley spread before that." "I heard," Ethan said. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer for the eastern section." He said a number. It was not a low number. It was, in fact, a number that a man in Ethan's position 6 months ago might have found very difficult to refuse. "That's 240 acres. You keep the house, the barn, the main pasture. You lose the eastern water access, but I'll put it in writing that I won't block the creek for 2 years. 2 years, Clara thought. She kept her eyes on the coffee she was pretending to sort. "I'm not looking to sell," Ethan said. "You're not looking to yet," Blackstone said pleasantly. "But you've had a hard few years. I know what the Callahan operation looked like before your—" A brief pause, a tactical pause. "Before your current arrangement. I'm offering you security, liquidity." "The operation is running well," Ethan said. Blackstone smiled. "I've heard the books look better. Congratulations." His eyes moved briefly to Clara, just briefly, and she had the distinct impression that he knew exactly who had made the books look better, and had chosen not to say so directly, and that this was also a kind of statement. "I'll leave the offer open until the end of the month. Think it over." He took his hat. He nodded at Clara with the minimal courtesy of a man discharging a social obligation. He left. Ethan stood in the kitchen for a moment after the sound of the wagon had faded, looking at the table where Blackstone's hat had been. "He's done this before," Clara said. She wasn't asking. "The Perkins place," Ethan said, "and the Hartleys, and before them 3 other properties going back 7 years. He buys them piece by piece." He sat down. "Perkins didn't want to sell either. He held out for a year, then his water access got complicated." "How complicated?" "Complicated enough that his herd lost a quarter of its weight one summer, and he couldn't make his banknote, and the bank, which Blackstone has connections with, called the note early." Clara was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "What's special about the eastern section?" Ethan looked at her. "What do you mean?" "He wants the eastern 240 acres specifically, not the western section, which borders better road access, not the north, which has the better soil, the east." She paused. "What's out there?" Ethan frowned. "The lower pasture, the creek, some old timber." "The creek," Clara said. He looked at her, and she watched the same calculation she'd been running arrive in his face a few seconds later. "The creek feeds 3 properties downstream," he said slowly. "If you controlled the source—" "You'd control the water for 3 operations, not 1, Clara said. "And right now, I'll bet you that at least 2 of those downstream properties are also in some stage of a Blackstone negotiation." Ethan was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. "Don't sell," Clara said. "I wasn't going to," he said. "Good, but that's not enough." She sat down across from him. "He's going to make it difficult. You said he did it to Perkins. Water complications, bank pressure. We need to understand what form the pressure is going to take before it arrives, not after." "How do you propose we do that?" "By talking to the people he's already bought out," she said, "and by making sure our own documentation is correct and complete. Water rights, boundary surveys, every agreement in writing." She paused. "And I want to look at the deed again." "The deed is fine," Ethan said. "It's been in the family for—" "I want to look at it anyway," she said, not insisting, but firm. He brought it out that evening. It was a document from 1871, 16 years old, filed with the Territorial Land Office and recorded properly. Clara read it carefully, line by line, the way she read contracts, not assuming that what it appeared to say was what it said, treating every word as a specific choice that meant something. She read it once, and then she read it again, and on the second reading she stopped at the 3rd page. The eastern boundary description was written in a way that was technically precise and practically ambiguous. It referenced a surveying marker that was almost certainly one of 2 possible markers, depending on which survey had been used as the basis. And if the wrong survey was assumed, the boundary moved approximately 40 feet to the west, which moved it past the point where the creek entered Callahan land. 40 feet. "Ethan," she said. He came to look over her shoulder. She pointed. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he understood what she was showing him. "That could be an error," he said. in the original filing. It could be, she said, or someone could argue it was an error when it was actually intentional and use it to contest the creek boundary. Would that hold up? I don't know. That depends on which survey record they present and who's deciding. She looked at him. We need a lawyer, and we need an updated survey from someone we choose, not someone Blackstone recommends. Lawyers cost money. So does losing the creek, she said. He didn't argue. He went to bed, and she stayed at the table with the deed and her notes and the growing architecture of a problem that was larger than she'd initially understood, and she sat with it in the particular way she'd always sat with difficult things, not trying to solve it all at once, but mapping it, identifying the edges, finding where the known stopped and the unknown began. The lawyer, when they found one, was a woman named Margaret Holt, who had recently relocated to Casper from Denver and had a reputation, Pete's wife had heard, for being thorough and unreasonable in the best possible way. She came to the ranch on a Wednesday, riding alone, with a document bag that looked like it had survived considerably more than one legal dispute, and she read the deed with the same close attention Clara had given it and said, after a long silence, "Where did you survey from in 1871? My father's filing," Ethan said. "He had it done by a man named Alcott." "Alcott," Margaret said. "I've seen his work before. He was generally reliable. The problem is there were two Alcott surveys in this county in 1870 and 1871, and the reference markers overlapped in the northern sections." She tapped the page. "This language here could be read two ways. If Blackstone has a lawyer who knows land law in this territory, he's going to read it the other way." "What do we do?" Ethan said. "You commission a new survey immediately, from a surveyor I recommend, using the most favorable defensible interpretation of this language. You get it filed before anyone else files a competing claim. And then," she said, looking at Clara, "you build a record that makes it very uncomfortable to argue against you." "What kind of record?" Clara said. "Evidence of continuous use," Margaret said. "How long have you been watering livestock from that creek?" 16 years, Ethan said, "since my father's time." "Witnesses? Consistent dates? Any written record? Correspondence mentioning the water access, supply orders that reference the creek grazing? Anything at all?" Clara looked at Ethan. He looked at her. She said, "I'll look through the household papers." She looked for 4 days. She went through everything in the house that was more than 2 years old, letters, receipts, the old ledgers from Ethan's father's time, correspondence about cattle sales, a box of miscellaneous papers that had been in the back of the storage room for years without anyone opening it. She made a pile on the kitchen table of everything that mentioned the eastern section, or the creek, or the lower pasture, and by the end of the 4 days the pile was significant. She brought it to Margaret Holt. Margaret went through it for 2 hours on the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Ethan checked fence line and Noah sat at the far end of the table doing his schoolwork with the focused quiet he brought to things that required concentration. Clara made coffee and did not interrupt and let the lawyer work. "This is more than I expected," Margaret said finally. She held up a letter from 1873 in Ethan's father's handwriting, referencing a dispute with a neighboring property about creek access that had been resolved in the Callahans' favor. "This alone is significant. It establishes the eastern creek boundary as a known contested and settled point." "Is that enough?" Clara said. "By itself, no. Together with the survey and the usage records and the deed, yes. I think it's enough to make a legal challenge very expensive for whoever tries it." She set the letter down. "Blackstone is smart. He probably knows a protracted legal fight would be costly for him too. What he's banking on is that you can't afford the fight, and he can." "He'd be right," Ethan said. He'd come in from the fence line without Clara noticing, and was standing in the kitchen doorway with mud on his boots and an expression that was honest in a way that cost him something. 6 months ago, he'd have been right. We don't have the money for a long legal battle. "No," Clara said, "but we're not the only ones he's done this to." Everyone in the room looked at her. She'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks, quietly, the way she thought about most large problems, letting it sit while she worked on the parts she could work on, waiting for the architecture to reveal itself. "The Perkins family," she said. "The Hartleys." The other 3 properties from before. What happened to those people? Did they leave the county or are they still here? Ethan thought about it. Hartley sold everything and went to Oregon. Tom Perkins is still in Hollow Ridge, doing day labor, I think. And the Brennans, from the '79 sale, they're still on their remaining land, the western section. If Blackstone misrepresented the boundary terms in other transactions, Clara said, or used the same survey ambiguity, we're not his first offense. We're his latest. And that means there's a pattern, and patterns can be documented. And documented patterns are evidence of a practice rather than an isolated dispute. She looked at Margaret. Is that right? Margaret was looking at her with an expression that was close to professional admiration. If you can demonstrate a consistent methodology of exploiting ambiguous survey language to acquire land under contested terms, yes. That changes the nature of what we're dealing with from a property dispute to something closer to fraud. She paused. It would also make it a matter of public record rather than a private negotiation, which limits Blackstone's ability to manage the story. He can't manage what's already in the open, Ethan said slowly. Exactly, Clara said. The work that followed was unglamorous and slow, and occasionally exhausting in the specific way that detailed, meticulous work was exhausting. Not dramatic, just demanding, the kind of effort that didn't generate much visible proof of itself until it was done. Clara visited Tom Perkins on a Tuesday, alone, bringing bread because she'd heard from Pete's wife that Tom's wife had been sick, and she sat in their kitchen and talked to a man who had once owned 400 acres and now owned a coat, and a habit of looking slightly to the side of people when they spoke to him, the way men looked when they'd been beaten badly enough to stop expecting things to be level. He didn't want to talk about Blackstone at first. She didn't push. She ate bread with them and talked about the spring calving and about Noah's schoolwork and about the way the county road past the North Ridge was deteriorating, and after an hour, Tom Perkins' wife, whose name was Ruth, refilled everyone's coffee and said, in a matter-of-fact voice that had the texture of something she'd been waiting to say, "He told us the survey was definitive." "What survey?" Clara said. "The one his man brought. They said it was filed with the territorial office. They said the boundary was clear and our water access wasn't in the deed." Ruth looked at her coffee. "It was. Tom's father had put it in the deed. We had the paper. But his lawyer said our paper was based on a faulty survey and the proper one superseded it. And by the time we found someone to tell us if that was true or not, the bank had already—" She stopped. "Do you still have the original deed?" Clara said. Tom looked up. "Why?" "Because I have a lawyer in Casper who I'd like to show it to," Clara said. "And I'm going to need to show her that what happened to you wasn't an accident." She came back from the Perkins place with a copy of their original deed, their permission to share it with Margaret Holt, and a feeling she recognized from the early days of untangling Ethan's accounts, the feeling of a picture coming clear, the specific satisfaction of a hidden thing becoming visible. The Brennans were more complicated. Patrick Brennan was a large, slow-spoken man with a profound distrust of lawyers that Clara had to spend 3 visits dismantling, and even then he gave her access to his records not because he trusted the process, but because his daughter, a sharp-faced woman of 30 who had been present at the 3rd visit, said flatly, "Pa, she's right, and you know she's right, and you've spent 4 years being angry in private, so maybe try being useful instead." Patrick Brennan gave Clara his records. By early May, she had documentation from 3 affected families. Margaret Holt had the surveyor's new filing, which confirmed the favorable boundary interpretation, completed and submitted to the Territorial Land Office in late April before anything else moved. The new record was clean, defensible, and now official. It was Ada who came to Clara first with the news that something had changed in Blackstone's approach. Ada heard things. She had a quality of being unmemorable in company that meant people talked around her without adjusting for her presence, which meant she was often the first person on the ranch to know what was circulating in Hollow Ridge's social geography. She came in from a supply run on a Friday afternoon and said, without preamble, "He's talking about you in town." Clara set down what she was doing. "What is he saying?" "The Callahan married a woman from Missouri who doesn't understand how things work here, that she's stirring up disputes that were settled years ago." Ada's voice was flat with contained anger. "That you're going to cost Ethan more than you're worth." He knows what we're doing, Ethan said. He was at the table and had heard this from the beginning. He's known for at least a week, Clara said. She'd expected this. Preparation always provoked counter-preparation, and a man like Blackstone with good sources would have known about the new survey filing when it went in. What else? He's talking to the supply house on the South Road, Ada said. I heard from the Kellerman boy, he does deliveries, that Blackstone placed a big order last month with an early payment, and now Kellerman's is saying they can't fill our spring order until July. Ethan stood up. We ordered in February. I know, Ada said. We have a paper saying, the supply house is saying there was a misunderstanding about the order date, Ada said. Their word against yours. The room was quiet. Who else do we order from? Clara said. Ada thought. Granger's, up past the North Road. More expensive. Longer haul. Can we make it work with Granger's pricing and delivery? Ada did a quick mental calculation. Tight, but yes. Place the order Monday, Clara said. She looked at Ethan. Don't fight the supply house. It costs time, and we'd probably lose, and it's not the main fight. Go around it. Ethan nodded, tight-jawed. He's going to keep doing this, Clara said. This is how it works. He doesn't come at you directly. He makes everything around you harder until you're so tired of fighting the small things that you sell to make it stop. She looked at the table. We need to make it cost him something. How? She looked up. Because what he's doing isn't just affecting us. It's affecting everyone in this county who's ever crossed him. And those people know what happened to them, and most of them have never had anyone explain to them what the pattern was. She paused. We need to call a meeting. Ethan looked at her. A meeting? With the Perkinses, the Brennans, and anyone else in this county who's had a property dispute with Blackstone in the last 10 years. Margaret Holt comes, explains what we've found, and people who have been dealt with separately start understanding that they weren't dealt with separately. They were dealt with systematically, and people who understand a system can object to it collectively. He's going to hear about it before we even hold it, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said. Let him. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression she'd come to associate with him processing something he didn't expect to find himself agreeing to. You're not afraid of him, he said. I'm a little afraid of him, she said honestly. He has more resources and more connections than we do, and he's been doing this for a long time. But fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. I'm afraid of him, and I'm going to do this anyway. She looked at Ethan. Aren't you? He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face settled. Not hardened, not closed, but decided, and there was a difference. When do you want to hold the meeting? He said. 3 weeks, she said. Enough time to contact everyone and give Margaret time to organize what we have. She paused. We'll hold it here. Here, he said. You can't stop something held on our own land, she said, and it will be harder to intimidate people who are already on Callahan ground. She looked at Ethan steadily. This is still our ground. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. It is. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd been upstairs, presumably doing schoolwork, but the house was not big and the kitchen conversation was not quiet, and Clara had understood for several weeks that Noah's apparent disregard for adult conversations was a studied performance. He looked at his father. He looked at Clara. He said, Are we in trouble? We're in a fight, Clara said. That's different. He considered this with the particular seriousness he brought to information he intended to keep. Are we going to win? We're going to try very hard, she said. That's the most honest answer I can give you. He thought about it. Okay, he said. He started to leave, then stopped. Pa? Yeah, Ethan said. That man that came in April, I didn't like him. No, Ethan said. Neither did I. Good, Noah said in a tone that settled the matter to his own satisfaction, and went back upstairs. Ada left for the evening. The kitchen quieted. Ethan sat at the table and Clara sat across from him, and they were both in the particular mode of people who have understood the size of a problem and are moving from understanding into planning, and it was not a comfortable mode, but it was a necessary one. He's going to escalate, Ethan said. Before the meeting, he's going to do something. Probably, Clara said. I've been thinking about what he's most likely to try. She pulled her notebook toward her. She kept notes on most things, had since childhood, a habit of documentation that had annoyed her family and that she'd long since stopped apologizing for. He can come at the bank if he has the connections there. He can interfere with more suppliers. He can try to discredit the survey legally, though that would be slow and Margaret's filing is solid. She paused. Or he can try to discredit me. Make it personal. He's already doing that, Ethan said. What he said in town, that's preliminary, Clara said. That's the first layer. If we hold the meeting and it goes well and we start building a real case, he's going to make it more personal. She looked at Ethan directly. He's going to say things about me that are designed to embarrass you, to make you feel like I'm a liability. Things about where I came from, what I look like, what kind of woman I am. Ethan's expression was very still. I want you to know that in advance, Clara said, so that when it happens, you're not surprised, and so that we've had this conversation before he's trying to have it for us. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara, he said, I know what kind of woman you are. She looked back at him. You walked into my kitchen in November and reorganized my entire operation in 3 months, he said. You found the creek boundary problem before anyone else was even looking for it. You talked to Tom Perkins when nobody else had bothered, because you were thinking 3 steps ahead. He stopped. I know what you are. Anyone who knew anything would know what you are. He paused. Victor Blackstone isn't stupid, so he knows too. That's why he's afraid of you. She hadn't expected that. The directness of it, the lack of decoration. She hadn't expected it, and she sat with it for a moment before she said, quietly, Thank you. I'm not performing, he said. That's just true. I know, she said. That's why it helps. Outside, the May evening was doing something elaborate with light and cloud over the western ridge, the kind of thing the country did routinely and without effort that Clara had not grown accustomed to yet, and she was glad she hadn't. She looked at it through the kitchen window for a moment, and then she looked back at her notebook and her notes and the careful architecture of what they were building, and she thought, this is what a fight worth having feels like. Not comfortable, not clean, not certain, but worth it. She picked up her pen. There was still a great deal of work to do. The meeting was set for the second Saturday in May, and Blackstone moved before they were ready for him to move, which meant he'd moved faster than Clara had calculated, which meant she'd underestimated something about him. And she spent 2 days being quietly angry with herself about that, before she set it aside and dealt with what was in front of her. It was the bank. Not the Territorial Bank in Casper, the local lending office in Hollow Ridge that held the note on the Callahan Properties equipment loan, a small debt that Ethan's father had taken out in 1878 and that had been rolling forward in manageable installments ever since. So ordinary and unremarkable that it had become part of the background of the operation, the kind of thing you paid without thinking about it, the way you paid for water or for weather. The letter arrived on a Monday. The lending office in Hollow Ridge was under new management. This was phrased carefully as a courtesy notification. And the new management had conducted a review of outstanding obligations and determined in its professional assessment that the Callahan equipment note was to be called in full within 60 days. 60 days. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and then stood up and walked to the far end of the room and stood there with his back to her, and Clara let him have a moment before she picked up the letter and read it herself. The number was not catastrophic by itself. In a different year, with different timing, they could have managed it. But it was May, and the expanded Moss contract wouldn't generate its first meaningful return until late summer, and the new supply arrangement with Granger's was more expensive than Kellerman's had been, and the survey costs and Margaret Holt's fees were still being absorbed. The 60-day window was chosen, she was certain, with exact knowledge of all of this. Blackstone or someone working for him had looked at Callahan's financial position with the same care she'd applied to it herself and had found the precise point of pressure that would cause the most damage. She set the letter down. How much do we have liquid? She said. Ethan turned around. He looked like a man who had been through enough that one more thing had a specific weight that was different from the weight of difficulty. About a third of what they're calling. Harlan Moss, she said. What about him? He expanded the contract because the operation was running well. He has an interest in the operation continuing to run well. She was thinking out loud, not performing confidence she didn't have. Early payment against the summer delivery. It's possible. I'd need to talk to him. That's asking for charity, Ethan said flatly. No, she said. It's asking for a business arrangement that benefits both parties. Those are different things. He looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression he got when he was working against his own pride, which was a thing he had a lot of, and which was not always an obstacle. Sometimes it was the thing that kept him standing. And if Moss says no, then we find another way, she said. But I want to try Moss first. She paused. Let me write the letter. You don't have to ask for it. I'll ask for it. He shook his head slowly. Clara. Ethan. She said his name the way she said most things, without decoration, direct. I know what it costs you to let me do this. I know it doesn't sit right, but right now what we need is the outcome. And I can get the outcome faster than you can because I'm not fighting myself while I'm doing it. She looked at him steadily. Let me write the letter. He said nothing for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and folded his hands on the table and said, Write the letter. She wrote it that afternoon. It was the most careful piece of correspondence she'd produced since her letters to Ethan from Levitt. Not personal in the same way, but personal in its own way. The way a letter that is asking for something real is always personal, whether it means to be or not. She explained the situation without excessive detail, laid out the business case for early payment clearly, proposed terms that were fair to Moss and survivable for Callahan, and closed without apology. She sent it with Pete, who rode to Casper on Wednesday, and came back Friday with a reply. Moss said yes. Not to everything. He negotiated 2 of the terms, but to enough. Enough to close the gap on the banknote with a modest buffer remaining. Ethan read Moss's reply and said nothing for a while. Then he said, He respects you. He respects the operation, Clara said, because of you. She didn't argue with that. She let it sit. The letter to the bank went out on Thursday with payment arrangements attached, and the 60-day pressure dissolved before it could do what it was designed to do, and Clara allowed herself exactly 1 evening of something close to relief before she turned back to the meeting. 23 people came. She hadn't expected 23. She'd reached out through Pete and through Ada and through Margaret Holt's network of county connections, and she'd hoped for 10, maybe 12. 23 people arrived on Callahan land on the second Saturday of May, some of them driving 2 hours to be there, some of them people she'd never met, people who had heard from someone who had heard from someone else that a woman at the Callahan ranch was gathering information about Victor Blackstone's land dealings and wanted to talk. They came because they were angry, most of them, with the specific chronic anger of people who had been wronged in ways they couldn't quite prove and had been carrying that weight so long it had become part of how they stood. Clara recognized that weight. She'd carried a different version of it for 28 years. She set up in the barn because the barn was the only space big enough. Pete and Charlie had cleared the floor and set out whatever seating they could put together. 3 actual chairs, 2 long boards on sawhorses, some bales of hay pushed into rows. It was not impressive. It was not supposed to be impressive. It was supposed to be functional, and it was. Margaret Holt stood at the front with the documents spread on a work table, and she explained what she'd found with the precise, undramatic delivery of a woman who understood that the facts were more alarming than any emphasis she could add to them. She walked through the survey language, the boundary interpretation methodology, the pattern across 7 properties over 12 years. She named dates and amounts and parties. She used the word systematic twice and fraud once, carefully, with a qualifier, but she used it. The room was very quiet during most of this. Tom Perkins said, about halfway through, in a voice that was controlled in the way of someone controlling something with some effort. He brought us a survey, his own surveyor. He said it was registered. It was registered, Margaret said, with an error that happened to benefit his boundary claim. Whether that error was deliberate is what would need to be demonstrated in a legal proceeding. She paused. But the same type of error appears in 3 of the 7 cases I've examined. The same type from different surveyors at different dates. That's not a coincidence. That's a method. Patrick Brennan's daughter, Clara had come to think of her as the sharp-faced woman, which was not kind but was accurate, said, "What does this actually get us? We've already sold. The Hartleys have already left the county. What does knowing this change?" For people who have already sold, the avenue is a fraud claim, Margaret said. That's harder to pursue. For people who are currently in a dispute or who Blackstone is currently approaching, she looked at Clara. The documentation we've built is a significant deterrent. He cannot move quietly anymore. Whatever he does next, he does with this record in existence. He'll come after you harder, someone said from the back of the barn. A man Clara didn't know, heavy set, with the look of a working rancher. For putting this together, you know that. Yes, Clara said. She'd moved to stand beside Margaret when the discussion started, not because she'd planned to, but because it felt like the right place to be. We know that. So why do it? Because he's going to come at us regardless, she said. The only difference is whether we've done this or not. And if we haven't done this, he does it to the next family quietly, and the one after that, and the record stays clean. She looked at the man in the back. I'd rather fight it now with people in this room than fight it alone later. A silence that was doing its own thinking. Ruth Perkins said from the second row, What do you need from us? Testimony, Margaret said. Written, notarized accounts of what happened to your properties. Specifically the survey presentations, the boundary claims, any documents you were shown. The more specific, the better. And if we give that and nothing comes of it, Tom said. Then you've lost an afternoon and some paper, Claire said. But it's in the record, and records outlast the people who made them. She looked around the barn at the 23 people who had driven varying distances to sit on barn boards and hay bales, and listened to a lawyer they'd never met explain something they'd already lived through. I know most of you didn't expect to be here today. I know some of you drove a long way. I know some of you are not sure you trust this. She paused. I'm not asking for trust. I'm asking for the information you already have. You lived through it. You know what happened. All I'm asking is that you let it be written down. The written accounts took 3 weeks to collect. Margaret had drafted a standard form, a one-page template that asked specific questions in a specific order, and Clara distributed them through the network that had assembled itself, checking in with each family, answering questions, doing the slow, patient work of building something from individual pieces that didn't look like much individually. Blackstone moved again while they were doing this. The cattle on the lower eastern pasture, 34 head that were grazing on the creek-adjacent land, the land whose boundary was now surveyed and filed and documented, were driven off one night in the 3rd week of May. Not stolen. Driven off, moved through a cut fence section onto open land to the north, scattered enough that it took 2 days to locate all of them, and one cow was never found. The fence cut was clean, professional, the kind of cut made by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to look like the cattle had pushed through rather than been pushed through. Ethan looked at the fence and at the churned ground and at the direction the cattle had gone and said nothing for a long time. He said nothing the way he went silent when something hit a place in him that was too old and too deep for words to reach quickly. Clara stood beside him and looked at the same evidence and felt something cold and exact settle into place in her thinking. I want this documented, she said, today, before anything is repaired. It's just cattle, Pete said. He'd ridden out with them. We got them back. It's not just cattle, Clara said. She looked at Ethan. Do you have a camera? What? A camera, a photographic camera. She'd seen one in Casper at a studio there. We need photographs of the fence cut, the ground, the area. If this goes to any kind of proceeding, we need evidence that exists independently of our testimony. Ethan looked at her. Where are we going to get? The newspaper office in Hollow Ridge, Ada said. She'd come out with them. The editor has one. I've seen it. Can we get him out here today? Clara said. I don't know, Ada said. I can ask. Ask, Clara said. The editor of the Hollow Ridge Courier was a small, energetic man named Silas Webb, who had opinions about everything and the specific courage of someone who believed deeply in the importance of what he did. Ada brought him out that afternoon, camera and all, and he photographed the fence cut and the ground and the trajectory of the cattle scatter, and while he was doing it, he asked questions in the manner of a man who was already writing a story in his head. What do you think happened here? Silas said. I think someone cut that fence deliberately, Clara said. I think it happened at night. I think whoever did it knew exactly which cattle they were moving and where they were moving them to. You think Blackstone is behind it? Silas said. not a question. I think that's a question worth asking in print, Clara said carefully. I think your readers would be interested in the broader pattern of property disputes in this county. I think some of them have been involved in those disputes themselves and haven't seen them described together before. Silas Webb looked at her over the camera. Are you asking me to write a story? I'm suggesting there's a story worth writing, she said. I can connect you with Margaret Holt and with 3 families who've agreed to speak on record. He was quiet for a moment with the considering look of a man whose professional instincts were arguing loudly with his awareness of who Victor Blackstone was in this county. Clara watched him work through it and did not press and did not perform confidence. And after a moment, Silas Webb said, I'll need a week. Take 2, she said. Take the time to get it right. The story ran in the Hollow Ridge Courier on the first Friday in June. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Ethan standing behind her, and Silas Webb had done exactly what she'd hoped. He'd written it carefully, with specific dates and specific amounts and specific quotes from people who had agreed to be named, and he'd described the survey methodology in language that a general reader could follow, and he'd asked, directly in print, whether the pattern constituted a systematic effort to acquire land under fraudulent boundary claims. He'd given Blackstone the opportunity to respond. This was in the last 2 paragraphs. And Blackstone's lawyer had provided a statement calling the characterization false and defamatory and threatening unspecified legal action. The threat of legal action, printed in the same article, had the opposite effect of what was intended. It made people read it twice. By the following Monday, Margaret Holt had received 3 additional inquiries from county residents about property disputes they hadn't previously brought forward, and Silas Webb had sold more copies of that edition than any edition in 2 years. Clara had not expected the article to end anything. She'd expected it to change the shape of the fight, to move it from something quiet and private into something that required light to operate in, and that was what it did. What she had not fully anticipated was what it would do in Hollow Ridge itself, in the daily life of the town, in the conversations at the supply house and the post office, and the 3 establishments that served as social centers for a community that had, it turned out, a great deal of stored resentment about Victor Blackstone that had never had a form to organize itself around. She went to Hollow Ridge the Wednesday after the article ran, for ordinary errands, and she felt the difference before she could describe it. People looked at her differently. Not all of them. Some looked at her the way they always had, the way people looked at an outsider who had married into something and hadn't fully explained herself yet. But some of them nodded in a way that had something behind it, and the woman who ran the dry goods store, a widow named Cecilia who had always been civil and not much more, said, when Clara was paying for her order, Tom Perkins came in yesterday, said you were the reason his wife slept properly for the first time in 4 years. Clara looked at her. Ruth is the one who wrote down what happened to them, she said. That's what mattered. Cecilia looked at her with an expression Clara couldn't quite categorize. He came in here 12 years ago, she said. Blackstone. Offered to buy the storefront. When I said no, my supply orders started coming in wrong for 6 months. Wrong items, wrong quantities. Always someone else's mistake, always just coincidence. She paused. I'd be interested in speaking to your lawyer. I'll have her contact you, Clara said. She drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light with a list of errands completed and 4 new names for Margaret Holt and the complicated feeling of someone who has set something in motion that is now moving under its own power, which was satisfying and also frightening in roughly equal measure. The response from Blackstone came not in a letter and not through a lawyer, but in person, which Clara had not predicted, and which was either a strategic decision or an emotional one, and she wasn't sure which was more dangerous. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, alone this time, without the 2 riders. That itself was a message, that he'd made a calculation that showing up alone was the stronger position, which meant he'd thought about this and decided that what he needed to communicate was personal rather than procedural. Ethan was in the north pasture. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard him on the porch and opened the door before he knocked and stood in the doorway with the particular quality of someone who is not moving back. Blackstone looked at her. He was still arranged the same way. The deliberate posture, the controlled face, but something in it had shifted. Not cracked, not yet. Compressed. Like a man who has been exerting pressure and is recalculating because the material isn't responding the way it should. Mrs. Callahan, he said, Mr. Blackstone. I'd like to speak to your husband. He's working, she said. I can get a message to him if you want to wait, or you can speak to me. He looked at her for a moment with the look she recognized from April. The reassessment look. The look of a man revising a category he thought he'd already filed correctly. I think it's best I speak to Ethan directly. He'll tell you what I tell you, Clara said. I'm not his speaking piece. We make decisions together. She paused. Would you like to come in? He came in. She did not offer coffee this time. They sat at the kitchen table, which she was aware was her table and which she'd become aware over the preceding months, carried a particular weight in how she felt about the house and about what she was in it. The article in the Courier, Blackstone said. I want you to understand what that's cost you. I'd be interested to hear your accounting, she said. He looked at her steadily. He was not an unintelligent man, and she'd never mistaken him for one. And what she saw in his face now was the particular look of someone who had arrived prepared for a version of this conversation and was already adjusting for the fact that it wasn't going the way he'd prepared for. There are people in this county who do business with me, he said. Supply, transport, seasonal labor. They'll remember who made things difficult. They'll remember what the Courier wrote, she said, and what other people tell them. Communities have memories, Mr. Blackstone. Longer than any one man's reach most of the time. You're from Missouri, he said. Not as an insult, as a fact deployed to carry the weight of one. You've been here less than a year. You don't know how things work here. I know how human behavior works, she said. I know that when people see someone doing to one family what's been done to them, they recognize it, and recognition changes how they respond. She folded her hands on the table. You built something over 12 years by working quietly, one family at a time, in private, with everything managed and contained. The Courier piece ended that. Whatever you do next, you do in front of people who are now paying attention. A silence. You've made an enemy, he said. His voice was still controlled, but the pleasantness was gone now, and what was underneath was older and harder and possibly more honest than anything else he'd shown her. You were already my enemy, she said. You just weren't open about it. He looked at her for a long moment. He stood up and picked up his hat, and she watched him calculate something behind his eyes. Not backing down exactly, but arriving at a decision about the next move, and she couldn't read what it was, which she didn't like, but which she'd learned to sit with because there was nothing to be done about what she couldn't read except stay alert. Tell your husband I came by, he said. Of course, she said. He left. And this time she watched from the window until his horse was out of the yard and down the road, and then she sat back down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed slowly and carefully, the way you breathed when you'd been holding something and needed to release it without letting it fall. Ethan came in an hour later and found her still at the table with her notebook open. She told him what had been said, all of it, with the same precision she used for financial reporting, not editorializing, just the sequence of events and the words used and the impression she'd taken from the words and from what was underneath them. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a while. Then he said, Are you all right? The question surprised her, and the surprise showed, which was unusual because she was generally good at containing surprises. I'm fine, she said. I'm thinking about what he does next. That's not what I asked, Ethan said. She looked at him. He was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms folded, and he was looking at her with the expression she'd come to understand as his most undefended one. The face he wore when he'd decided to be direct because the situation required it, and he was going to be direct regardless of what it cost him. I'm a little shaken, she said, because it was true, and he'd asked and she'd made a policy for herself a long time ago of not lying when the truth was available. He's not afraid of us. I wanted him to be afraid, and he's not. And that means whatever he does next is going to come from confidence rather than desperation, which is harder to anticipate. We've anticipated it pretty well so far, Ethan said. We've stayed ahead, she said. Barely. And I don't know if we stay ahead on the next one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off from the counter and came to the table and sat down across from her in the chair that had become, over 8 months, specifically and recognizably his chair. When I was 23, he said, my father had a bad year. Worst year the ranch had seen. Lost a third of the herd and the west fence went down in a storm, and the equipment broke in 3 places in the same month. I remember watching him at this table. He looked at the table briefly. He wasn't scared. He was the most worried I'd ever seen him, but he was working. Just doing the next thing. Not trying to solve all of it, just doing the next piece of it. Clara looked at him. I've been trying to be him since this started, Ethan said, trying to do the next piece of it and not think about the whole picture too much. He paused. You're better at the whole picture than I am. You've been carrying it, and I haven't said... He stopped, started again. I should have said it before. You've been carrying this, and I've been letting you carry it, and I don't know if that's right. It's what I'm good at, she said. That doesn't make it right, he said. It just makes it useful. She looked at him for a long moment. I chose this, she said. I came here because I wanted somewhere worth building. I'm not carrying it because you made me. I'm carrying it because it's mine to carry. It's ours, he said, simply, without decoration. She held his gaze. I know, she said. That's why it's possible. Noah appeared, as Noah sometimes appeared at the ends of things, with the uncanny timing of a child who moves through a household at a frequency adults don't track. He came in from outside with mud on his boots, and an air of having just finished something physical and satisfying, looked at his father and his mother. His mother, which was what he called her in his head, Clara had known this for at least a month without either of them having acknowledged it, and said, Is the bad man going to take our land? No, Ethan said. How do you know? Because your mother won't let him, Ethan said. Noah considered this with the seriousness he brought to information he intended to file permanently. Okay, he said. He looked at Clara. Pete says you scared him. Pete says a lot of things, Clara said. Pete's usually right, Noah said, and went upstairs to wash his boots. In the following weeks, Margaret Holt filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but an official documented inquiry into the survey practices in 7 named property transactions, with supporting testimony from 12 individuals, the Callahan documentation, and Silas Webb's article appended as public record. It was not a dramatic move. It was a meticulous one, the kind of move that operated slowly and without spectacle, and that people like Victor Blackstone, who had built their operations in spaces that official processes didn't quite reach, had good reason to find threatening. 3 weeks after the filing, the regional banker who held Blackstone's financing relationships received a copy of the inquiry from Margaret's office, accompanied by a letter explaining the nature of the documented claims. Clara had suggested this. Not to destroy Blackstone's credit, she wasn't in the business of destruction, but because a man whose financing relationships were paying attention to a fraud. Inquiry was a man with fewer resources for extended aggression. The fencing on the eastern pasture was repaired and reinforced. Ada implemented a night check rotation for the lower herd that added to the work but reduced the risk. The documentation stayed current and complete. One evening in late June, Clara was at the desk in her south-facing room. Her room, where she kept her books and her notebooks, and the 4 years of accumulated household correspondence that she'd organized into a system that would survive her if it needed to. When Ethan knocked on the open door, she looked up. He held out an envelope. Came today, he said. From Levitt. She looked at the handwriting, Delia's. She took it without opening it immediately. Ethan stood in the doorway a moment longer, not asking, just there. I'll read it later, she said. He nodded, started to go. Ethan. He stopped. Whatever she says, Clara said, it doesn't change anything. He looked at her for a moment, with the direct, undefended look, the one that meant what it showed, and said, I know that. Then he went, and she set the letter on the corner of the desk where she would get to it when she got to it, and she picked up her pen and went back to what she'd been working on, which was a set of notes for Margaret on the next phase of the inquiry. Outside, Hollow Ridge was doing what it did in late June, the grass high and the creek running and the sky enormous in every direction. And the ranch was doing what it had started to do since November, which was something other than merely surviving. It was thriving. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, not in the way that anyone would call smooth, but it was thriving in the way that real things thrived, by doing the work, accounting for the weather, and not letting go. Clara rode on, and the evening settled around the house, and somewhere downstairs Noah was reading aloud to his father the way he sometimes did on summer evenings, stumbling over the longer words, Ethan's low voice occasionally supplying the ones he missed, and the sound of it came up through the floorboards like something she hadn't known she was waiting for until she heard it. She let it sit there while she worked. She did not make a production of it. Some things were large enough that making a production of them would only make them smaller. She just let it be there, and it was enough, and she turned the page and kept going. Delia's letter sat on the corner of Clara's desk for 11 days before she opened it. She was not avoiding it exactly. She was busy. The inquiry filing had generated paperwork that required responses. Margaret Holt had questions that required research. The summer herd management was at a peak that required Ada and Pete at full capacity, and Clara filling whatever gaps appeared. And the letter from Levitt was the kind of thing that could wait because it belonged to a different version of her life, one that didn't require immediate attention the way a fence line or a financial filing required it. But on the 12th day, on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet, and Ethan had taken Noah fishing at the creek, and she was alone in the way she was rarely alone anymore, she opened it. Delia wrote the way she'd always spoken. Bright surface, sharp underneath, the brightness and the sharpness sometimes indistinguishable from each other. The letter was 3 pages and covered several topics. Their mother's health, which was declining in the gradual way of women who had worked hard their whole lives and were beginning to hand that work back. Rose's second pregnancy. The social events of Levitt's summer season. It was 2/3 of the way through the second page that she got to the thing she'd actually written the letter to say. I heard from Mrs. Alcott. You remember her? Her son Thomas married the Greer girl from the East Road. That you've been making quite a name for yourself out there. Something about a land dispute. She said you were the one running it. I didn't know what to say to her. I still don't entirely know what I think about all of it, Clara. I want you to know that I think about it. What we did. The letter. We thought it was funny, and I suppose it was, to us, at the time. And I've been sitting with the fact that it wasn't funny, that it was cruel. I'm not good at saying things like that. You know that about me. But I'm saying it anyway, because I think you deserve to hear it. I'm sorry we sent that letter. I'm sorry for what I said afterward when you told us you were going. I was unkind about it. I didn't believe you could do what you've apparently done, and that was my failure of imagination, not evidence about you. The 3rd page returned to ordinary news. It ended with Delia's name and a postscript. Mother asks about you. Write to her. She won't ask herself, but she wants to hear. Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the desk beside her notebook, and sat with the window light coming in from the south, and thought about what she felt. She felt. Not much, was the honest answer. Not the satisfaction she might have expected, not the sting of old wounds reopened, not the complex emotional weather that Delia's name had once reliably produced in her. She felt something quieter than any of those things. Like a room where a draft had been stopped. Not warmer exactly, just stiller. She wrote back that afternoon. 2 pages, even in length, covering the ranch and Noah and the inquiry, and 1 careful paragraph about Delia's apology that said, in essence, I hear you. Thank you for saying it. There's nothing to undo, so I've stopped trying to undo it. But I appreciate that you wrote it down. She wrote to her mother separately, longer. She described Hollow Ridge in the physical terms her mother would understand, the dimensions of the house, the way the kitchen sat relative to the morning light, the specific quality of Wyoming cold versus Missouri cold. She did not perform happiness. She described what was real, which was sufficient. She sealed both envelopes and set them by the door to go out Monday, and she went back to work. July arrived with heat that clarified everything. The distances, the colors, the specific weight of the air in the afternoon, and with it came the Territorial Land Office's formal acknowledgement of Margaret Holt's inquiry. It was not a ruling, it was not even a finding. It was a letter saying that the inquiry had been received, logged, and assigned to a reviewing officer, and that the office would respond within 60 to 90 days. It was bureaucratic language doing what bureaucratic language did, which was move at its own pace regardless of urgency. But it was official. And official meant that something that had existed only in their documents and their conversation now existed in a government record, which was a different kind of existence entirely. Margaret sent a copy to Clara with a brief note. This is what we were working toward. The rest takes time. Clara put the acknowledgement in the file she'd built for the inquiry. A thick file now, organized by date and category. The kind of document record that told a story if you knew how to read it, and which she had made sure multiple people knew how to read in case something happened to her ability to tell it. Blackstone was quiet through most of July. That itself was information, and she treated it as such. Not reassurance, but data. A man like Blackstone going quiet meant he was working on something he didn't want visible. And whatever he was working on would arrive when it was ready, not when she was prepared for it. It arrived in the last week of July, and it was not what she'd expected. It was a second article in the Hollow Ridge Courier. Not written by Silas Webb, written by a man named Carson, who Clara had never heard of, who had apparently contacted the Courier as a correspondent from the regional newspaper in Cheyenne. The article was about the territorial land inquiry, and it raised what it called questions about the motivations and methods of the parties who had filed it. It referred to Margaret Holt as an attorney with limited territorial experience, and described the inquiry as potentially the result of a coordinated campaign by outside interests to interfere with legitimate land commerce in Hollow Ridge County. It quoted, anonymously, several local businessmen who felt that the situation had been exaggerated for personal gain. It did not name Clara directly. It referred to a recently arrived Missouri woman, once, in a sentence about the Callahan Ranch, and the sentence was neutral in its language and devastating in its implication, in the way that neutral sentences sometimes were. Silas Webb printed it because he had to, or felt he had to. It had been submitted through proper channels, and he was an editor who believed in printing things that met his standards for sourcing, and this one technically did, in the way that technically was sometimes the worst word in journalism. He sent Clara a note with the issue saying only, "I didn't commission this." The correspondent came through the Cheyenne office. "I'm sorry." Clara read the article at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with Pete and Ada and Ethan all present because they'd gotten into the habit of mornings together in the kitchen over the preceding months, the 5 of them. Charlie was usually there too, appearing for coffee before he could reasonably be expected to be awake. And the kitchen in the mornings was the closest thing to a council the ranch had, which was not something any of them had formally decided, but which had become true by accumulated practice. She read it and set it down. Pete read it over her shoulder. He said something under his breath that she decided not to hear. "He found someone," Ethan said. He was reading the byline. "Carson. I don't know that name." "Someone in Cheyenne with a press connection," Clara said, "or someone who has that connection and made that call." She was thinking out loud, which she did in this kitchen now without self-consciousness, because the people in it had proven over 7 months that they could be thought out loud at. He couldn't fight the inquiry directly because the documentation is solid, so he's going after the character of the inquiry instead. Make it look like a coordinated attack rather than a documented complaint. "Is it working?" Ada said. Clara thought about it honestly. "Some people will believe it," she said. "Some people want to believe it because it's easier than believing that something systematic happened to their neighbors and they didn't notice." She paused. "It won't stop the inquiry. The filing is in. The reviewing officer has it. What this does is make it harder for the people who gave testimony to feel confident about having given it." "So what do we do?" Charlie said. He was on his 3rd coffee and had the look of someone who was waking up to something larger than the morning. "We talked to the people who gave testimony," Clara said, "before they read this article from someone else and start wondering." She spent 2 days visiting. She took the wagon and drove to each family who had signed a statement. Not all 23, but the 12 who had put their names on official documents. And she sat in their kitchens and their parlors, and she told them the truth, which was that the article was a response to the threat they represented collectively, and that a response meant they had caused enough concern to be worth responding to, and that being worth responding to was different from being worth dismissing. Ruth Perkins, at the end of one of these visits, said, "He's trying to make us feel stupid for speaking up." "Yes," Clara said. "Is it working on you?" Clara looked at her. "No," she said, "but I want to make sure it's not working on you either." Ruth looked at her with the clear, tired eyes of a woman who had seen a lot and survived most of it. Tom doesn't sleep well, she said. He worries. He thinks we made a mistake putting our name on that paper. What do you think? Clara said. A pause. I think if we don't put our name on things, nothing is ever different for anyone, Ruth said. I think we've been waiting 12 years for someone to say what you said in that barn, and now that it's been said, I don't want to unsay it, just because someone in Cheyenne wrote something unkind about it. Then tell Tom that, Clara said. I have, Ruth said. He listens better coming from someone else sometimes. All right, Clara said. I'll talk to him. She talked to Tom on the way out. She stood at the fence where he was doing repair work, and she told him the same thing she'd been telling everyone. And then she told him something additional, that the 12 people who had signed statements had created a record that existed independently of any of them now, and that the record would do its work whether or not any individual person remained publicly confident about it. You don't have to be brave every day, she said. The document is brave on your behalf. That's what documents are for. Tom Perkins looked at the fence post he was working on. My father used to say the only thing that lasts is what you write down, he said. Your father was right, Clara said. By the time she'd completed all 12 visits, it was August, and August in Wyoming had a particular quality that she'd come to understand as the year turning a corner. Not ending, not yet, but the light shifting in a way that made everything slightly more serious, the summer haze burning off and the country showing itself with a specific clarity it reserved for the late season. The Territorial Land Office's response came on the 14th of August. Not in 60 to 90 days as they'd promised. In 41, which was itself a signal of something, though Clara had learned not to overinterpret signals from bureaucratic offices because they sometimes signaled nothing more than a reviewing officer who happened to work quickly. But this signal meant something. The letter stated that the reviewing officer had found sufficient basis in the submitted documentation to open a formal investigation into survey and boundary representation practices in connection with 7 named land transactions in Hollow Ridge County over the period 1877 to 1889. It named Victor Blackstone by name as a party of interest. It requested additional documentation from the filing parties and set a formal interview schedule for submitted witnesses. Clara read it 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she took it to Ethan, who was in the barn, and she handed it to him and waited. He read it. He read it again. He looked up. His face was doing something that she'd only seen it do twice before. At Noah's birthday in February and on the morning the Moss contract had come through, the specific expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for so long that the moment he can set it down, he doesn't quite know what to do with his hands. It's a formal investigation, she said. I can read, he said, but not unkindly. It doesn't mean it's over, she said. It means they're taking it seriously enough to investigate. Blackstone still has resources. He still has lawyers and connections, and he'll use all of them. I know, Ethan said. I just want to be clear about what we have and what we don't have. Clara. He looked at her directly. I know what we have. He held up the letter slightly. We have this. That's more than we had in April. He paused. That's more than I thought we'd have when he first walked into the kitchen. She looked at him. You're not allowed to manage the moment, he said. This is a good thing. Let it be a good thing for a few minutes. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully known was tightened. All right, she said, a few minutes. He smiled. The actual smile, the one he kept for moments that had earned it, which was not the same as the managed expression he used for social occasions, and which had taken her months to learn the difference between. I'm going to tell Pete, he said. He's going to say something highly specific under his breath, and then pretend he's not happy about it. He's going to be insufferable, Clara said. Completely, Ethan said, and went to find Pete. She stood in the barn alone for a moment and let herself feel it, the specific quality of a thing that you've worked for arriving in the form you hoped for. It was not triumphant. It didn't feel the way victories were supposed to feel in the stories she'd read, with their clean emotional architecture and their satisfying finality. It felt more like a long hill. You reached the crest, and you could see further than you'd been able to see from the bottom, and what you saw was more country to cross, but you could see it now, and that was different from not being able to see it. She went back to the house. She needed to send word to Margaret. The investigation moved over the following months with the pace of official processes, which was to say it moved in a way that required patience as a deliberate practice rather than a natural tendency. There were interviews in September. Clara gave hers in Margaret Holt's office in Casper, sitting across from a territorial officer named Reeves, who was methodical and thorough, and who asked questions that demonstrated he had read every page of the submitted documentation, which was both professionally reassuring and personally uncomfortable in the specific way that having your work examined closely was always uncomfortable, regardless of its quality. Blackstone's lawyers filed 2 motions to dismiss the investigation on procedural grounds. Both were denied. The second denial in October was accompanied by an expansion of the scope of the inquiry to include an 8th transaction that the reviewing officer had identified independently during the investigation. The 8th transaction was from 1876, before Clara's time, before the scope she'd been working with, a land acquisition involving a family named Garrett, who had left the county entirely. Margaret tracked down the Garrett family's surviving son in Colorado through a series of letters that took 6 weeks. He had his father's original deed, which he'd kept in a box in a rented room in Denver for 11 years, and he mailed a copy to Margaret with a letter that said, among other things, "I always thought what happened to my family was wrong. I just didn't think anyone would ever bother to listen." Clara read that sentence and felt it in a particular place. She knew exactly what it meant to not think anyone would listen. She knew the specific habit of mind that developed when you moved through the world as someone whose observations about wrongness were received as complaints rather than as evidence. She wrote to the Garrett son. She told him what they'd found, what had been filed, what was happening now. She told him his father's deed mattered. She told him the box in the rented room had been worth keeping. By November, 1 year, almost exactly, since Clara had stepped off the train at Hollow Ridge Station with her trunk and her books and her practical boots, the investigation was ongoing, and the outcome was not certain, which was the honest description of where things stood. But the shape of what was possible had changed so fundamentally from what it had been 12 months ago that certain and uncertain were almost beside the point. What was certain? Blackstone had not acquired a single additional property in Hollow Ridge County since the Courier article in June. What was certain? 3 families had retained legal representation and were pursuing civil claims. What was certain? The bank that had provided financing for several of the disputed transactions had quietly restructured its relationship with Blackstone's operations in a way that his former lawyer, who had parted ways with him in September, had mentioned in passing to Margaret, who had mentioned it to Clara. What was certain? The Callahan Ranch had met its Moss contract numbers for the summer and was positioned to exceed them in the following year. The final ruling came in January, 14 months after Clara had arrived, 13 months after she'd first read Ethan's account books by lamplight at the kitchen table and found the entries that didn't add up. It was not a criminal ruling. She had never expected a criminal ruling. What it was, a formal finding by the Territorial Land Office that Victor Blackstone and associated parties had engaged in a systematic pattern of misrepresenting survey boundaries in land acquisition negotiations, constituting fraudulent inducement under territorial statute in 5 of the 8 examined cases. The finding recommended referral to the Territorial Attorney General's office for further action. It mandated the review of all outstanding land titles held by Blackstone interests in the county, and it included in its formal documentation a line that Clara read 4 times before she let herself understand what it meant, that the boundary established by the Callahan Survey of April 1889 was the operative and legally binding description of the eastern section of Callahan Ranch, including water access rights to the creek and its tributaries. The creek was theirs. It had always been theirs. Now it was theirs in a way that was on record, that would survive any future challenge, that was as real and as permanent as anything in the territorial archive could be. Ethan heard the news at the end of a working day from Clara, who read the relevant sections of the letter at the kitchen table the way she'd read everything important, directly, without editorializing, letting the language do what it was there to do. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Pete was there, and Ada, and Charlie, and Noah, who had gotten home from school an hour before and positioned himself at the table with his schoolwork in the manner of someone doing something unrelated to the conversation while being entirely aware of the conversation. Ethan sat with his hands on the table. He looked at Clara. "Is it over?" he said. "For us," she said. "The civil cases will go on longer. The Attorney General referral will take time. But for this ranch, for this land, for the creek, yes, it's over." He nodded slowly. Something in his shoulders moved, a change in how he was holding himself that was subtle enough that she might not have noticed it a year ago. She noticed it now. "Good," he said. And that was all, and it was the right word, because some things were large enough that the right word for them was a small word, and Ethan Callahan had always understood this better than most. Pete said the specific thing under his breath that he said when he was not performing happiness, which was a variation of what he'd said in the barn the previous August. And Charlie laughed at it, and Ada looked out the window with the expression she used when she didn't want anyone to see her face directly. Noah closed his schoolbook. He looked at his father, then at Clara. He said, with the directness of a 9-year-old who had been following events for a year with the attention of someone much older, "Did we beat him?" "We documented him," Clara said. "That's better than beating him." Noah thought about this. "Why?" "Because beating him is temporary," she said. "What's in that ruling is permanent. It's in the record. It says what he did and who he did it to, and it will still say that long after all of us are gone." "Oh," Noah said. He sat with that for a moment. "Is he going to jail?" "That's not our decision," Ethan said. "That's the Attorney General's." "But he might?" "He might," Clara said. Noah appeared to find this an adequate answer. He reopened his schoolbook and returned to his work with the air of someone who had gathered the information he needed and was now returning to other business. Tom Perkins came by the following week. He didn't send word ahead. He rode up in the late afternoon, and Clara saw him from the window and went to the door, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said, "Ruth wanted me to bring you something." He held out a jar. Preserves, dark and glossy, the kind that Ruth put up in quantity every fall. "She said she's been sleeping better." Clara took the jar. "Tell her I'm glad," she said. He looked at his hat. He was a man who had been beaten and knew it and was carrying the particular shape of someone who was starting, very slowly, to put that down. "I don't know if what you did is going to get us anything back," he said. "The land is gone. The arrangement we had is gone. I'm not sure a legal finding changes what we're living." "It doesn't give you back what you lost," she said. "I know that. I just wanted to say that." He looked up. "I also wanted to say that it was right anyway. What you did. Whether it gets us anything or not, it was right to do it. And I didn't say that clearly enough in the barn." She looked at him for a moment. "You put your name on the statement," she said. "You drove out here in May with a dozen other people who didn't know if it would matter. That's what right looks like. It's not one thing. It's all those small decisions that nobody claps for." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He rode back the way he'd come, down the road between the low ridges, and Clara watched him go and felt the complexity of what they'd done and hadn't done, which was different from the simple narrative that was starting to circulate in Hollow Ridge about what had happened. The story, where the brave woman from Missouri had defeated the corrupt land baron and justice was served and everyone could rest. That story was easier and less true than the actual story, which was that a great deal had been documented and some things had been stopped and some people had been held partially accountable and other things had been lost permanently, and the people who had lost them were still living with the loss regardless of what any ruling said. That was the actual story. It was less satisfying and more real, and she thought you had to be able to hold both, the real story and the satisfaction of what had actually been accomplished, without letting one erase the other. The winter that followed was hard in the specific way Wyoming winters were hard, which was completely and without apology. The house held it. The ranch held it. The herd numbers were up from the year before, and the Moss contract renewal came through in January with terms better than the original, and Clara sat with the account books in February and saw, for the first time since she'd opened them, numbers that looked like what she'd believed was possible when she'd explained to Ethan what the ranch could be. She'd been right. She noted this without excess feeling, the way she noted most things. Being right was satisfying. Taking more satisfaction in it than it warranted was a different thing. Ethan found her at the accounts on a Thursday evening in February, a year and 3 months after she'd first sat at this table with his father's ledgers, and he looked at what she was looking at and said, "Well?" "Better than last year," she said. "If the spring calving is reasonable and the moss numbers hold, we'll be clear of the equipment debt by September." He sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the easy way he was quiet now, without the compressed quality it had had when she'd first arrived, when silence from him meant managing rather than simply being. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He looked at her with the direct, undefended expression. "When you were on that train from Levitt," he said, "what did you think it was going to be?" She considered the question honestly. "I thought it was going to be hard," she said. "I knew it was going to be hard. I hoped, that hard would be enough. That if I could be useful, if I could do the work and do it well, that would be enough to justify being here. And now?" She thought about that, about Noah reading to his father in the evenings and the sound of it coming up through the floorboards, about the way Ada moved through the morning routines with the unself-conscious ease of someone who belonged somewhere, about Ruth Perkins sleeping better, about Tom Perkins's hat in his hands, about Silas Webb's note, about Ethan's shoulders, the way they'd changed over 14 months in increments so small you'd only notice if you'd been watching carefully, about the creek running clean along the eastern edge of their land, which was their land in every way that mattered now. "I don't think about justifying it anymore," she said. "I think about what needs doing tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, in the voice he used when he meant something precisely and was choosing the simplest possible way to say it, "I'm glad you answered the letter." She looked at him. "Which letter?" "The first one." He paused. "Mine." She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. It was not a dramatic moment. The kitchen was ordinary around them. The lamp burning, the cold pressing against the windows, the sound of Noah upstairs doing something that involved his boots moving back and forth across the floor in a pattern she'd long since stopped trying to interpret. The accounts were open on the table between them, columns of numbers that told the story of a year in the language of work and attention and things that had been fixed because someone had paid attention to whether they were broken. That was what it came down to, in the end. Not heroism, not transformation, not the arrival of someone exceptional into a situation that needed exceptional intervention. Just attention. Sustained, daily, unglamorous attention to what was broken and what could be fixed and what needed to be documented and what needed to be fought and what needed to be let alone. Clara had been paying attention her whole life. In Levitt, Missouri, she'd paid attention in rooms where no one thought her observations mattered, where she'd been told by the simple arithmetic of how she was treated that she was not the sort of person whose attention was worth anything. She'd paid attention anyway, because she was constitutionally unable to stop, because it was the thing she did the way some people sang, or some people ran. It was her specific nature, her gear, the thing she'd been given that she hadn't known how to use until she'd arrived somewhere that needed using. She thought about that sometimes, about all the years in Levitt when she'd been paying attention and no one had needed what she saw. About the specific cruelty of that, which she did not minimize, the waste of it, the loneliness of it, the years of being right about things in rooms where being right didn't matter because no one was asking. She didn't look away from that. She didn't reframe it into gratitude for the lesson or tell herself it had built her into something better. The years in Levitt had been what they were, and what they were was hard and diminishing and real. But she'd brought herself out of Levitt with what she'd developed in it. The patience of someone who had been underestimated, the endurance of someone who had been doing difficult work without recognition long enough to stop needing the recognition, the skill of a woman who had been invisible in rooms and had used the invisibility to see. She'd brought all of that to Hollow Ridge, and Hollow Ridge had needed exactly that, and she had given it, and it turned out that what you gave and what you were and where you were could sometimes align so completely that the rightness of it was simply obvious, the way an answer was obvious when you'd been working the problem long enough. That wasn't luck. though it looked like luck from the outside. Delia had thought it was luck. The people in Hollow Ridge who were now telling the story of Clara Callahan as though she'd arrived already heroic thought it was luck or fate or some quality so rare it was practically supernatural. What it was: a woman who had spent 28 years developing skills in rooms that didn't value them, and then found a room that did. That was available to anyone, was the thing. Not easily, not without cost, not without the specific difficulty of continuing to be yourself in conditions that suggested you should be something else. But it was available. The skills you were building in the rooms that didn't see you were still being built, whether or not the room saw them, and there was always another room. That was what she believed. She had tested it against her own experience carefully and found it held, with the appropriate caveats, that not everyone who deserved a different room found one. That the path between Levitt and Hollow Ridge required not just her willingness, but a chain of circumstances, a letter, a man who asked for strength instead of beauty, two sisters who'd been cruel without understanding what they were setting in motion. She knew all of that. She didn't turn it into a simple story. But she held the belief anyway, because the belief was true in the cases where it was true, and those cases were enough to matter. Spring came the way Wyoming spring came, abruptly, definitively, the ground going from frozen to soft in what felt like a week, and the grass coming up with the urgency of something that had been waiting under pressure and was now released. The calving season was good, better than the year before, better than the year before that. Ada moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had now done it twice and knew the rhythms well enough to anticipate rather than just respond. And Pete was Pete, steady, wry, perpetually claiming he was too old for this while being demonstrably not too old for any of it. Clara had taken on something new in the spring. She was meeting twice a month with a group of ranch women from the surrounding county who had organized themselves loosely around the shared challenges of frontier operations, supply access, medical information, legal rights, the specific gaps that existed when you were operating at a distance from the institutions that were supposed to serve you. It had started as two women who'd been at the May meeting asking Clara questions, and then a third who'd heard about the first two, and then somehow a Thursday afternoon gathering at rotating properties that now had 11 regular members and a waiting list of women who wanted to join. She hadn't planned it. She noted this about herself: that the things she built most durably were rarely the things she'd intended to build. She'd come to Hollow Ridge to fix an operation. She'd fixed the operation, and in the process had fixed other things, had become part of a community in ways she hadn't anticipated, had made friends, a word she used carefully because she didn't use it for what she didn't mean, in Ruth Perkins and Margaret Holt and Cecilia from the dry goods store, who had given a deposition in the investigation and then come to one of the Thursday meetings and turned out to have strong and specific opinions about supply contracts that had restructured the group's purchasing arrangement by the end of the month. Ada came to the meetings. Ada came to everything, and her quality of being easy to overlook had expanded from a personal trait into something she'd started to use deliberately. She'd started paying attention to what people said when they forgot she was there, and she'd become, over the course of a year, one of the most reliably informed people in the county, which was a form of power she wore without making a production of it. On a Thursday evening in April, 18 months after Clara's arrival, after the meeting had concluded and the last of the women had driven home, and the kitchen was back to its ordinary self, Noah came downstairs in his nightclothes and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, without apparent context, "Billy Alcott said, his father said you think you run the county now." Clara looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said you don't think you run the county," Noah said. "You just fix things." He paused. "That's different." "It is," Clara said. He nodded, apparently satisfied. He started to go back to bed, then stopped. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his back to her, in the posture of someone working up to something, and she waited. "I told him something else," Noah said. "What?" He turned around. He was 9 years old, and he was the son of a careful, closed man and a woman who had died before he could remember her well, and he had spent the years since learning to protect himself by holding things back. And what Clara saw in his face in that moment was someone making a decision about whether to hold something back or let it out. And she watched him make the decision and didn't try to make it for him. I told him, Noah said, that you were my mother. He paused. And that if he said anything about you, I'd hit him. Clara looked at him steadily. You shouldn't hit people, she said. I know, Noah said. I didn't. I just said I would. Good. She held his gaze. And Noah. Yeah. Thank you, she said. For what you said. The first part. He looked at her for a moment with his father's directness and something that was entirely his own, some quality that was neither Eleanor's nor Ethan's but was being built right now at 9 years old, in this kitchen, in this life they were making. You didn't have to come here, he said. You could have not answered the letter. I know. But you did. I did. He stood there a moment longer, like someone finishing a calculation. Okay, he said, which was what he said when something was settled, and went upstairs to bed. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a while after, in the quiet that was the particular quiet of a house that was full of sleeping people. The specific quality of occupied silence, warm and textured, the silence of somewhere that was lived in by people who intended to keep living in it. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and full of weather, the stars visible in the way they were visible on clear April nights in the high country, with a sharpness that felt like a statement rather than a condition. Clara had learned to read the sky out here, not the way you read it for information exactly, but the way you read something you're still in the process of understanding. Ethan came in from the last check of the evening and found her there and sat down across from her without comment, the way he did things now, without preamble, without ceremony, just present. He looked tired in the way of a man at the end of a good day rather than a bad one, which was a different variety of tired that she'd learned to distinguish by the way it sat on his face. Noah's in bed, she said. I heard the stairs. He looked at her. You all right? Yes, she said. And then, because it was true, and he asked real questions and deserved real answers, I was thinking about Levitt. What about it? She considered. I was thinking that I don't recognize the woman who left, she said. Not the way I thought I would. I thought I'd look back and see someone smaller and feel sorry for her. But I look back and I mostly see someone who was already what she was going to be, just in a place that didn't have any use for it. She paused. It wasn't that I became something here. I just became it in the right place. Ethan looked at her. Do you think there's a difference? I think there has to be, she said. Otherwise, what were all those years for? He was quiet for a moment. For building what you brought here, he said simply. She looked at him. He shrugged, with the slight self-consciousness of a man who has said something true that he wasn't sure he was going to say. You didn't arrive empty, he said. You arrived with 28 years of paying attention in places that didn't pay you for it. That's what you used. He paused. I got the benefit of 28 years of someone else's difficult life. That's not nothing. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the table, at the account book she'd closed, and the lamp burning, and the ordinary equipment of an ordinary evening in a house that was genuinely hers, and she felt something so quiet and so whole that it didn't have a convenient name. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was in it. It was not pride, though she was not ashamed of what she'd done. It was something more like recognition, the specific experience of looking at your life and finding that it matches, finally, the shape you were always trying to grow into. She had not been given this. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind, now and always. She had not been rescued. She had not arrived and been transformed by someone else's love or someone else's need. She had arrived with everything she needed already built into her, built by years of difficult work in rooms that didn't see her. And she had used it, and the using had built more, and that was how it worked. She thought about the women who would come to the Thursday meeting in 2 weeks. Some of them were in the early stages of something she recognized, the specific situation of someone who was more capable than their circumstances were giving them credit for, someone learning to operate in the gap between what they were and what the world was willing to acknowledge they were. She didn't know what to tell them exactly. She was still figuring it out herself. But she thought the most honest thing she'd ever found to say about it was also the least satisfying thing, and it was, Keep the records, do the next piece of work. Don't let the room you're in define what you're worth. The rest was specific to each person and each place. There was no instruction set. There was only attention and time and the willingness to show up the same way, with the same version of yourself, every morning that the morning came. She picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to Margaret about the spring documentation, and another to the Garrett son in Denver who had sent the deed, and a third to her mother in Leavitt, who had written back in February with a letter that was shorter than usual and more direct, ending with a sentence that Clara had read several times and still wasn't entirely sure how to receive. I should have seen you better. I'm sorry that I didn't. I hope Wyoming is treating you the way you deserve to be treated here. She would write back. She would say something true, and not too large, and not too small. She would tell her mother about the creek. The lamp burned. The house settled around her the way old houses settled, with the small sounds of wood and weight and weather. Outside, the country was enormous and indifferent and completely, wholly hers. She put pen to paper and began.